Thutmosis I, his his life story reads almost like a soap opera. It is so interesting what all takes place. It's a very interesting history of his family. His royal wife, whose name was Amos, bore him a daughter whose name was Hatshepsut. If you'll recall, that was one of the historians' ideas of who the Pharaoh was. Hatshepsut. That's his daughter. And Thutmosis I also had a concubine, Mutnofret was her name, who bore him a son. And he named that son, obviously, Thutmosis II. Now, at this time period in Egyptian history, it was very common to keep the bloodline for succession pure. So what they would often do is they would have brother and sisters marry in the royal family. That's what we see occurring here. And we do know this took place. And like I say, it was to keep the succession going. We discover through Egypt's history that Hatshepsut did marry her half-brother, Thutmosis II. Now, he was a teen when they got married. So he marries his half-sister, Hatshepsut, but Thutmosis II was never a very healthy person. He was a sickly child from what we can read in all the details that the Egyptians left for us about his life. He did a very short reign. He didn't live very long, a short reign, but during this short reign, he did put down some rebellions in distant lands. So the new kingdom is trying to expand out. But one thing that is noted about Thutmosis II was his extreme cruelty to male children of less important people, like slaves. He was extremely cruel. He had a daughter with Hatshepsut. Neferu Ra was her name, but she's a female. He goes on and has an affair with, or I should just say, he had a second wife, or a concubine, you might say, whose name was Iset. Iset actually fathered a son for him, whose name he gave was Thutmosis III, who would grow up without his dad, because soon after Thutmosis III is born, Thutmosis II dies. And as his son is an infant, he cannot take over the throne. Without an adult heir, they needed to have a new pharaoh. So what ends up happening is Hatshepsut replaces the king, Thutmosis II, as the new pharaoh. Yes, it was his sister and his wife of Thutmosis II, but she assumes the role of pharaoh, bypassing, this is important, bypassing this infant son, who's really, I mean, at this point, he's too young to rule. So Hatshepsut now becomes the pharaoh. Hatshepsut is one of the most interesting people I've ever read about in Egypt's history. I love reading about her. Many books have been written about her, and her tomb is well known. It's a big tourist attraction today. Fascinating story about this gal. She was a female in a male-dominant world. There's no question about it. But when she assumed the role of pharaoh, she went so far as even dressing as a man. She would even wear a fake beard when she would go out among the people and stuff. Now, Hatshepsut was brilliant, an extremely intelligent lady. And so what she did, she worked upon primarily the culture of the people and the finances and things to make Egypt really, really prosperous. And during her time, it was mostly, as she started her reign, it was a time of peace. And Egypt just prospered. It was like they became so rich, they became so powerful and wealthy at this point. She began several building projects, which her father had also started. She continued on this. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned her tomb before, Hatshepsut's tomb is a magnificent structure, rivaling many other features that you find in ancient Egypt. It's a very popular tourist attraction, and it shows, again, how intelligent she was to have all of this done, and also the splendor of her kingdom at this time. So she was just something of a paradox to many other type of pharaohs that you see. And reigning for about 20 years, Hatshepsut only had one daughter. And scholars believe that she longed to have a son. Now, some scholars, Egyptologists, have suggested that she was so dedicated to her role of pharaoh, she didn't go off after her husband died and have other children and stuff with male concubines or whatever, that she put her endeavors and her energies into the country itself. But they also state that she longed to have her own son. because she knew her daughter would never be able to become Pharaoh, especially with Thutmosis III growing up. So, according to some Egyptologists and some of the books I've written, it appears, this is sort of speculative, but this is what they believe, many believe, that Hatshepsut went down to the Nile god, Hapi, of the Egyptians, and prayed for a son, though like supernatural means, because she was not going to marry somebody else. And that the Nile god Hapi actually granted her request and gave her a foreign male child that she found in the Nile. She brings this child into the house of Pharaoh and raises him in the house of Pharaoh with all the education and everything that the new Pharaoh would need. Now, this unknown, because we do not know the name of the person, who this son was. We do not know the name from Egypt's history. But what's really interesting, after a while, he just seemed to disappear. And like I say, all signs of his name are removed. But we have no idea who he was, really. But isn't it interesting how this fits the whole story of Moses' birth and how he came to be into Pharaoh's house? Doesn't this seem to sort of be similar? You know, you can't help but see some correlation between this adopted, unnamed foreigner and the story of Moses that you find in the Bible. If it is true, one could obviously see then why there'd be animosity between this foreign child being raised under Hatshepsut and Thutmosis III, who is the rightful heir as time goes on. Well, what ends up happening? As successful as Hatshepsut's reign was, the infant Thutmosis III is going to grow up, and he does. And he's destined to become, if you've never heard of him, I'd be a little surprised, he was the greatest pharaoh in Egypt's history. This guy was brilliant. He was a military genius, for one. He was destined to become the greatest pharaoh and extend the borders of Egypt to the farthest extent they would ever be in its entire history, because he conquered all the way up into Turkey, which is where the Hittites were. He conquered into lower Turkey, across over to like the Tigris, Euphrates rivers, into that area, and he conquered down to the south of Egypt and across North Africa. I mean, this guy is sometimes called the Napoleon of Egypt, because he was so into expanding the borders. So that's what he was doing at first as he co-reigned. Hatshepsut lets him co-reign, but then he's becoming more and more powerful. Where Hatshepsut was so dedicated to increasing the financial and the cultural aspects of Egypt, Thutmosis III was a conqueror. And his exploits are still studied in military schools to this day. Now, Thutmosis III, as he gets older, and he is the rightful heir, male heir of this, he seems to really despise Hatshepsut for obvious reasons, I think, but he probably even more. He led a coup d'état and removed Hatshepsut from the throne. She died about a decade later. According to Egypt's history, she would have been just before Moses led the Hebrew people out of the nation of Egypt. Thutmosis III eventually orders then the removal of Hatshepsut's images throughout the kingdom. That is why today, if you look this up, or if you go to Egypt or different museums, you see very, very few images. There's a few that have survived that came from her tomb, but most of her images have been defaced. Her names have been chiseled off. And exactly why he ended up hating her so much is partially a mystery, but we can pretty well guess, it's because she was ruling and maybe even possibly having someone else in mind to be the successor after her. I mean, there's many theories that abound on this, but we do know, there is no question about it, that what ended up happening is he had her name removed from almost all monuments, had it chiseled off. To let you understand how severe this was, that Thutmosis III really despised Hatshepsut, here is an image of a photograph we took at the Penn State Museum. And this is a famous lintel. It's called the lintel of Hatshepsut and Thutmosis III. It has both their names on there. But if you'll notice on the image, on the two lower lines on the left, a section of it has been chiseled off. You can see hieroglyphics written across, but in the two bottom lines over on the left side have been chiseled off. And that's where we know the name of Hatshepsut was. So after Thutmosis III takes over the kingdom, he orders her name removed. And you see this all through Egypt. This is not the only place you see this, but this is a clear example of what I'm talking about. He really did not like her for some reason. As it continues, Thutmosis III, as I said, was the most powerful and the greatest pharaoh of all. He ruled for 54 years. That's the longest rule of any pharaoh in its history. And that long reign itself, 54 years, that fits the biblical time frame that we have. Because according to biblical time frame, if you recall, Moses is kicked out of the land. Well, if Thutmosis led this coup to get rid of Hatshepsut, he obviously would have got rid of the adopted son, so he flees for his life. That makes perfect sense. And Moses is gone for 40 years. This fits into this time frame.
Support the show. Become a donor at evidenceforfaith.org/give.